Who, in the middle of a Formula One race, would have the courage to brake in the middle of the track, abandon the competition, and run alone towards a burning car to try to save another driver? In a sport driven by speed, rivalry, and millions at stake, attitudes like this seem impossible. But this story really happened, and it wasn't an isolated act. It was a reflection of character, of pure humanity, amid the noise of engines and the smell of burning gasoline. His name, David Purley, a British driver who many may not even know, but who carried out one of the most heroic and painful gestures in the history of Formula One. It was the 70s, an era in which danger was part of the package. The tracks were walking traps, security was minimal, and death was always there, lurking around every bend. In this tense scenario, where pilots were racing not only against time, but against their own destiny, David made a decision that would forever mark his life, and the memory of those who watched that scene. He could have walked straight past like the others. After all, it wasn't his responsibility. But something inside him spoke louder. And what you discover now may surprise you, or even move you. Because this story is not about podiums, statistics, or titles. It's about courage, empathy, and a kind of bravery that isn't measured in trophies. Have you ever imagined yourself in his place? Racing against time, against fire, against impotence? Stay with me until the end, because what happened that day at the Dutch Grand Prix is not just a tragic chapter in Formula One. It's a living reminder that even in one of the most ruthless sports in the world, there are still men who put the lives of others above their own. And the way everything unfolded will make you see this pilot with different eyes. Now, take a deep breath, because what comes next is chilling. Purley tried it himself. As other cars passed him, as the inspectors looked confused and time ran, away like sand, he fought, with his bare hands without protection, against a fire that was already consuming everything. The images are difficult to watch even today. It gives a lump in my throat just imagining the despair of seeing someone alive there, asking for help, and realizing that no help would come in time. David didn't save Roger Williamson, but his gesture was so powerful, so genuinely human, that it still resonates with motorsport lovers today as a reminder of what really matters. If this type of story also touches you, if it has ever moved you, to see someone putting others above themselves, even when everything told you not to do that, leave here in the comments what has struck you most so far. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to act on instinct, even if no one else did the same? I really want to read what you have to say. The exchange we build here is what makes this space so special. When you comment, like, and subscribe, you are helping not only this channel to grow, but also to bring stories like David Purley's to more people who may have never heard of this name, but need to. So, if this makes sense to you, leave a like now, and subscribe to continue receiving videos with real, emotional, and above all, human stories. Because behind the helmets and the absurd speeds, there are people, and some of them, like Purley, remind us what it means to be a real hero. And now that you're up to speed on what happened that day, it's time to go even deeper into the story. David Purley was not a name that dominated the newspapers at the time. He wasn't a top driver, he didn't race for the biggest teams, nor was he surrounded by fame or glamour. In fact, he was seen by many as an outsider to the world of Formula One. A determined competitor, coming from a wealthy family, but eager to make a name for himself on the track. A former soldier, he served as a paratrooper in the British Army, and this experience on the battlefield shaped much of his mentality. Cold blood, courage, and a sense of responsibility that went beyond the simple act of running. He wasn't just a driver trying to win races. He was a man who brought with him a rare code of conduct, a way of seeing the world that didn't depend on spotlights to exist. At that time, the early 70s, Formula One was brutal. Not figuratively, it was literally a battlefield disguised as a sport. The cars were fast but fragile. The tracks are dangerous. And the idea of security was still seen as an obstacle to the purity of competition. The pilot knew that each start could be his last, and there were many who lost their lives. Each season, names were scratched from the pits and became memories. To give you an idea of the risk, in some years, 3 or 4 drivers died in a single championship. This created an atmosphere in which fear was normalized and death was almost trivialized. And in this scenario, Purley emerged as someone who did not accept this normalization. He wasn't driven by blind adrenaline, but by a deeper sense of responsibility. The hidden truth behind many races of that time was this. While the public saw glamour, entire backstage areas were marked by tension, insecurity, and life-or-death decisions. Formula One, in that format, required much more than talent behind the wheel. It required nerves of steel and often a certain insensitivity to the suffering of others. But David was different. What he did at the Dutch GP was only possible because that strength already existed within him. The decision to stop the car, to abandon his race, his chance, and run towards the fire was not improvised. It was a reflection of who he was. It's as if all the previous experiences on his journey, the army, training, life outside the F1 bubble, had prepared him for that specific moment. While others followed the competitive instinct, he followed the human instinct. And this contrast says a lot about the mentality of the time, about how accustomed the racing system was to silencing emotions in the name of performance. The curious thing is that despite everything, Davi was never treated as a legend in the following years. On the contrary, his story remained there, somewhat erased, restricted to those who really knew the behind-the-scenes of Formula One. Perhaps because he had not won major titles, perhaps because his act of bravery exposed truths that the world of motorsport was not ready to face. It's uncomfortable to think that one man alone did more that day than the entire security structure around him. It is uncomfortable to realize that the transformation necessary at that time only began to happen after tragedies like these came to light. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject. Because when we observe what happened on that circuit, it is impossible to ignore the weight of the decisions taken and not taken at that moment. How an entire system failed while a single man fought the impossible. There is something about this contrast that forces us to reflect, not just as Formula One fans, but as human beings. What kind of culture was that taught to move forward even when someone screamed for help? Because what happened on that track in Zandvoort in 1973 was not just a tragic accident. It was a mirror of a collective mindset that failed. It was lap number 8 of the Dutch Grand Prix when Roger Williamson's car lost control at high speed, blew a tire, flipped violently, and landed upside down. The impact was brutal. The car immediately caught fire, and at that moment, what should have triggered a quick emergency protocol didn't trigger anything. Roger was alive, conscious, trapped, upside down, screaming for help as the cockpit was engulfed in flames. And all of this before the eyes of the world, with cameras broadcasting live, with track marshals nearby, but who, for reasons that are still debated today, did not move. Maybe due to lack of adequate equipment, maybe out of fear, maybe out of total unpreparedness. But the truth is that no one approached. Nobody tried. It was then that David Purley, who was following closely behind, saw the smoke, smelled the smell of burning fuel, and did the unthinkable. He stopped. He literally stopped the car on the side of the road, turned off the engine, and ran towards the fire alone. There was no time to think. It was a purely instinctive decision, a visceral response to seeing a human being trapped in a car turning into a furnace. What comes next is difficult to describe in words, but Purley's every gesture in that moment carries enormous weight. He tried to put out the fire with the small extinguishers he found, which barely released foam. He tried to turn the car with his hands, using his body as a lever, trying any movement that could free Roger. He fought against the heat, against the smoke, against despair. All this while the inspectors watched, transfixed. Some approached and returned. Others just stared, and the cars continued to pass along the track. The race was not stopped. There was no red flag. The pilot inside the burning car screamed for help, and life continued all around, as if nothing was happening. This contrast is suffocating. Track speed and slow response, the action of a man and the inertia of a system, Roger's tragedy and David's impotence. And the cruelest thing, Williamson did not die on impact, nor immediately in the fire. He died of suffocation from the smoke. Dying slowly, hearing the noise of the race going on around him, and probably seeing or feeling that only one person was trying to save him. This hurts. It hurts because it reveals an uncomfortable truth. In critical moments, it is not the structure that responds first, but the individual. And when the structure fails as it failed that day, all that is left is the courage of those who cannot stand still. It is impossible to watch images of that moment without feeling affected. David wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a firefighter. He didn't have equipment. But he had a conscience. And perhaps most importantly, he had empathy. That attitude, even without success, revealed more about him than any result on the track could reveal. While some watched without taking action, he gave himself up. And this raises profound questions about how we deal with collective responsibility, about how we react under pressure, and about how those who have the power to help are not always those who are best prepared, but rather those who have the right mindset. There are many layers to this episode. The first is the tragedy itself. The second is Formula One's systemic failure to offer a quick, safe, humane response. But the third, and perhaps most transformative, is the quiet impact of David Purley, a pilot who didn't save his friend's life, but saved something even rarer: the value of humanity in a sport that, until then, seemed indifferent to the suffering of its own. It wasn't just a landmark moment, it was a watershed, even if silent. The hidden truth behind the 1973 tragedy is that it exposed what everyone avoided facing. The system was broken. This moment, captured by cameras that today seem more fragile than a cell phone, serves as a record of a culture that needed to change. And it changed, little by little, but it changed. Because the emotional impact of seeing someone trying alone, without protocol, without support, with their own hands, made a lot of people rethink the direction of things. Purley's attitude planted a seed, and although he himself was left out of the official narrative of Formula One for many years, anyone who knows this story knows. That was where something began to fall apart. And it was from there that a lot of things had to be rebuilt. Already write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what came after the accident in Zandvoort was not just a predictable consequence or a formality. It was, in fact, a silent, almost uncomfortable chapter in the trajectory of a man who experienced what few have the courage to face: the collision between human instinct and an indifferent system. David Purley was awarded the George Medal, one of Britain's highest civilian honors for bravery off the battlefield. And even so, his name never circulated with the same weight as other Formula One heroes. Perhaps because he was not celebrated for victories, but for doing what everyone knew was right, and that few, deep down, would be willing to do. The way Formula One treated Purley after that episode reveals a lot about the behind-the-scenes culture of the time. He was not embraced as a symbol of change. He didn't become a poster child for safety on the slopes. He was not called to protocol meetings or to print campaigns. On the contrary, it seemed that his attitude put an uncomfortable lens on a hidden truth, that there was something deeply wrong with the way risk was handled. It was easier to forget what he did than face what it meant. But Purley followed. He kept competing, kept running, perhaps trying in his own way to take back a place that seemed to have never been fully given to him. 2 years later, he tried to return to the Formula One circus with more strength, more structure, more desire. And it was then that he experienced the second most memorable and unbelievable moment of his journey. In 1977, during training for the British GP at the Silverstone circuit, David suffered an accident that, to this day, defies the logic of survival. Your accelerator stuck on entering a curve. The car went straight and crashed into a concrete wall at more than 170 km/h. But the most impressive thing was not the speed, it was the slowdown. The sensors showed that David's body was subjected to a force of 179.8 G at the time of the collision. To give you an idea, an average human being will faint with about 5 GI sustained for more than a few seconds. Fighter pilots and astronauts are trained to resist forces between 7G and 9G for brief moments. And even in Formula One accidents, the numbers rarely exceed 60 degrees. Purley faced almost triple that, and he survived. The impact was so violent that the car's chassis practically disintegrated. David's legs were crushed. He suffered multiple fractures to his ribs, pelvis, femur, ankle. He was trapped in the wreckage, conscious, feeling every second of that slow, painful rescue. But he didn't die. He survived what doctors and engineers said was impossible. He was hospitalized, operated on numerous times, and spent months in rehabilitation. Many thought he would never walk again, but he came back. And more than that, he returned to flying, not in F1, but in smaller races, flying his own planes, seeking to somehow continue being himself. This accident didn't make headlines for days. There was no tribute, no fanfare. Most Formula One fans didn't even know that that absurd number, 179.8 G, had been recorded by a driver who had already tried to save another from the flames a few years earlier. The silence that surrounded this part of Purley's story is almost as eloquent as the accident itself. It's as if he was too big to fit into common narratives, but at the same time, too uncomfortable to be truly celebrated. And here comes an interesting point in his journey, his sense of mission. It's as if David had an internal commitment, a personal compass that pushed him forward even when everything said he should stop. There is a profound transformation in this type of trajectory. It is not the transformation of conventional success, of titles, of glory. It is the transformation of identity, a man who looks death in the face more than once and continues, not out of pride, not out of necessity, but because he feels he hasn't accomplished everything he came to do. David Purley was never the fastest driver. It was never among the favorites. But the strength of his presence, the impact of his decisions, and the way he handled every curve, literal and metaphorical, made him something rare. A symbol of values that don't depend on results to make sense. His story forces us to think about how we measure success, what we choose to applaud, and who we stop listening to when the spotlight turns elsewhere. He was not shaped by the circus of Formula One. He passed through it like a breath of lucidity in an environment addicted to speed and silence. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because when we reach the final part of David Purley's journey, we can no longer just talk about Formula One, about racing, or about statistics. The conversation now is about legacy, about what really remains when the lights go out, when the applause stops, and when the official narrative has gone in another direction. And the most curious thing, perhaps even symbolic, is that Purley, this man who defied logic twice, did not die in a circuit. It wasn't in a racing accident. It was not surrounded by crowds or amidst broadcast cameras. It was in silence in 1985, flying his private plane when it crashed in the English Channel between England and France. The irony is heavy, because it was as if he had escaped all the planned dangers, all the situations that seemed to have a fixed destiny, and right there, on a routine flight, his life ended. But history does not erase with death. On the contrary, sometimes it only begins to be truly understood when the character is no longer here. And this is what has been happening, slowly, with the figure of David Purley. His name, forgotten for many years in F1 narratives, began to gain another meaning as more people started to look with different eyes at what really matters in a career. What makes his story so powerful is precisely what it forces us to confront. What kind of courage are we celebrating? The one who takes risks for glory, or the one who takes risks out of compassion? The one who makes history through numbers and records, or the one who transforms everything around her simply because she chose to act? Purley was not molded to be a classic hero. He didn't fit into the frames that the sport liked to portray. But precisely for this reason, the impact he left is even more relevant. Because what he did was not the product of a script. It was a real choice, in a real moment, with no guarantees of anything. There are decisions that are made with months of preparation, with analysis, with calculations. But there are others that appear at the exact second that life demands a response. This was the scenario in Zandvoort, and the decision David made in that moment perhaps says more about the kind of human being he was than any track result ever could. There were no bonuses. There was no guaranteed recognition. There was no one watching with the intention of rewarding. And yet, he went. It is important for us to reflect on the type of mentality that allows a person, at the height of risk, to move out of empathy and not out of fear. This is an internal transformation that cannot be learned in gyms, that cannot be trained on simulators. It comes from a deeper place, from a true connection with what is understood as purpose. And perhaps this is precisely what sets people like Purley apart, the awareness that their journey is greater than the place it occupies in the official records. In times where everything needs validation, metrics, public relevance, remembering someone who did the right thing without expecting anything in return is almost revolutionary. And when we look at what he faced afterwards, the accident at Silverstone, the long months of recovery, the physical limitations that accompanied it, and yet the insistence on moving forward, we begin to understand that courage, in his case, was not an isolated moment. It was a pattern. It was a repeated, silent, continuous choice. This type of person bothers you because they break standards. She does not serve as an easy example, nor as a simplified character. The hidden truth about real heroes is that they are not always recognized in their time. Because their greatness does not depend on the validation of others, it happens precisely in the absence of it. And this brings us to an essential point of this conversation. How ready are we to recognize courage in its rawest, most genuine, most human form? Purley wasn't just a pilot. It was a living reminder that amid performance, competitiveness, and the cult of results, there can still be room for humanity. And perhaps this is the most difficult thing to preserve, because the world of racing has changed, and fortunately, it has changed a lot. Today there are protocols, safer cars, trained teams, reactions in seconds. But is there still that instinctive impulse to act for others with all this technology? That spark that makes someone cross the line of fear out of a sense of moral duty? This is a question that cannot be answered with graphics. The answer is by looking at the values we carry and the examples we choose to remember. In recent years, some voices have spoken about Purley again. Short documentaries, mentions in podcasts, articles on specialized websites, but it's still little. It's still as if his story is on a parallel plane, waiting to be brought back with the respect it deserves. And not because he needs it, but because we need it. We need more references like this, which remind us that the true impact of a life is not in its length, nor in the number of awards accumulated, but in the strength of the decisions it makes when no one else has the courage to act. This story has the power to cross time, contexts, niches. Because it's not just about Formula One, it's about transformation, of legacy. It must be understood that there are gestures that cannot be ignored because they represent the most integral part of the human being. And when these gestures come from within a sport known for its coolness, they become even more valuable. David Purley faced what few would endure. He went where almost no one would go. He didn't worry about what the world would see later. He just did what was right. And that's why, even outside the statistics, even far from the records, his name continues to resonate with those who choose to look beyond the surface. It is in this respectful, almost whispered silence that his memory endures. And perhaps, today more than ever, we need to stop for a moment and ask, what kind of legacy do we want to leave? Comment there. Courage that transforms. If you've made it this far, it's because this story also spoke to you in some way. And I'm happy about that, because stories like this deserve to be remembered, commented on, felt. If at any point in this video you caught yourself reflecting, getting emotional, or seeing Formula One with different eyes, leave a like. This helps a lot to keep this space alive, with content that goes beyond the surface, and that highlights what really matters. Take advantage and subscribe to the channel too. Here the idea is precisely this: to bring to light stories that, even out of the spotlight, have a real impact. With each video, we dive a little deeper, not just into the races, but into the people behind them, the decisions, the revelations that most people miss. Oh, and if you stayed with me until the end, comment below. I'm with you until the end. It's our way of recognizing those who walk along on this journey. There's a video here that complements this topic. Click and stay with me there. You'll be surprised at what you still have to discover.